The morning mist clung to the French countryside like a shroud, as Captain Daniel Daly crouched behind the twisted remains of a farm gate, his weathered hands gripping his Springfield rifle. It was June 6, 1918, and the acrid smell of cordite mixed with the sweet scent of blooming wheat fields, a grotesque contradiction that would haunt his memories forever. Behind him, 200 Marines from the 5th Regiment waited in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces painted with mud and determination. "They're calling us devil dogs now," whispered Gunnery Sergeant Ernest Jansen to his men, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of German artillery. The nickname had emerged from German reports describing the fierce fighting spirit of the American Marines who had arrived in France as part of the American Expeditionary Forces under General John Pershing. These weren't the same Marines who had chased pirates in the Caribbean or fought in small colonial skirmishes. These were men about to face industrialized warfare on a scale that would redefine their very identity. The German spring offensive had pushed Allied forces back 40 miles toward Paris, and now the Second Battle of the Marne hung in the balance. Major General Omar Bundy's 2nd Division, which included the 4th Marine Brigade, had been rushed to plug a dangerous gap in the French lines near Château-Thierry. The Marines found themselves facing the Imperial German Army's elite stormtroopers in the dense, forbidding woodland known as Belleau Wood, a name that would soon be etched in blood and legend. As referenced in the Marine Corps' Times historical analysis, the tactical situation was desperate, but contained within a relatively small area of operations. The Germans had established machine gun nests throughout the tangled undergrowth, creating interlocking fields of fire that could cut down advancing troops. With devastating efficiency, Colonel James Harbord, commanding the Marine Brigade, knew his men were walking into a meat grinder, but retreat was not an option. The forest itself seemed alive with malevolent intent. Ancient oak and beech trees, their trunks scarred by shrapnel, towered over a labyrinth of fallen logs, dense thickets, and shell craters filled with stagnant water. German snipers had turned every shadow into a potential death trap, while their machine gunners waited patiently behind carefully constructed positions. This was not the kind of warfare the Marines had trained for in their Caribbean expeditions, or their brief deployments to protect American interests abroad. Lieutenant John Hughes, known to his men as Johnny the Hard, gathered his platoon around him as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy. These Marines had come from every corner of America: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, cowboys from Texas. Many had never seen combat before, but they carried themselves with the swagger of men who believed they were invincible. That confidence would be tested in ways none of them could imagine. The signal came at 0500 hours, a whistle blast that seemed to tear through the morning air. Like a banshee's wail, Captain Daly rose from his position and, according to legend, shouted the words that would echo through Marine Corps history. "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" The charge began not with the coordinated precision of textbook military tactics, but with the raw fury of men who refused to yield an inch of French soil to the Kaiser's army. The wheat field stretched before them like a golden sea, deceptively peaceful in the early morning light. But as the Marines of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Regiment advanced across the open ground toward Hill 142, that tranquil facade shattered under the storm of German machine gun fire. Private Karl Brannan felt the bullets whizzing past his ears like angry hornets as he pressed forward through the grain, his heart hammering against his ribs with each step. What the Marines encountered that morning of June 6 would later be described by military historians as one of the most brutal frontal assaults in American military history. The German machine gunners, positioned in expertly camouflaged positions along the tree line, had clear fields of fire across the entire approach. Every few yards, another Marine would stumble and fall, his blood soaking into the rich French earth that had seen too much death already. Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient from previous campaigns in China and Haiti, moved through the chaos like a man possessed. At 44 years old, he was ancient by infantry standards, but his presence steadied the younger Marines around him. When a machine gun nest pinned down his squad, Daly single-handedly charged the position, lobbing grenades with the precision of a man who had done this dance of death many times before. The forest edge bristled with German steel and determination. The enemy soldiers were not the demoralized conscripts that Allied propaganda often portrayed, but veteran troops from elite divisions who had been transferred from the Russian front after the Bolshevik Revolution. They knew these woods intimately, having spent weeks preparing defensive positions that took advantage of every natural feature. According to historical records referenced in the Britannica military archives, the initial Marine assault resulted in devastating casualties. Over 200 men fell in the first hour alone. Yet something extraordinary happened among the survivors. Instead of breaking under the pressure, they adapted with a ferocity that surprised even their own officers. Squad leaders began coordinating small unit tactics on the fly, using covering, fire, and movement techniques that had never been formally taught in their training. Corporal Joseph Robinson, barely 19 years old and fresh from a farm in Nebraska, found himself leading a makeshift squad after his sergeant was cut down by sniper fire. With no formal military education beyond basic training, Robinson instinctively understood that survival depended on innovation. He began using hand signals he invented on the spot to coordinate with nearby Marines, creating a primitive but effective communication system that would later influence Marine Corps' tactical doctrine. The German defenders were witnessing something they had not encountered on the Western Front. American troops who seemed to thrive on adversity, unlike the war-weary European armies that had been ground down by 4 years of attrition. These Marines possessed an almost reckless optimism that translated into tactical aggression. When conventional approaches failed, they improvised. When their officers fell, the enlisted men stepped up without hesitation. As the day wore on, individual acts of heroism began to weave themselves into a collective narrative of Marine Corps' identity. When Private Henry Larson was wounded while trying to rescue a fallen comrade, he continued fighting from his prone position until blood loss finally overcame him. His last words, according to witnesses, were not a cry for his mother or a prayer to God, but a defiant challenge to the Germans. "You haven't killed us all yet." The battle for the wheat field raged throughout the morning, with neither side able to claim decisive victory. But something fundamental had changed in the character of the Marines fighting there. They were no longer simply soldiers following orders. They had become something new, something forged in the crucible of modern warfare. The transformation was visible in their eyes, in the way they moved, in the grim determination that replaced their earlier bravado. The entrance to Belleau Wood gaped before them, like the mouth of some primordial beast, its shadowed depths promising nothing but pain and death. By June 10th, the Marines had been fighting for 4 days straight, and their ranks had been decimated by the relentless German resistance. Yet as Captain Lloyd Williams surveyed the dark forest ahead, he felt no inclination to retreat. When a French officer suggested his exhausted men might want to fall back and regroup, Williams delivered the response that would become Marine Corps' legend: "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." The interior of Belleau Wood was a nightmare landscape that seemed designed by malevolent gods. Ancient trees, some dating back centuries, had been shattered by artillery bombardment, creating a maze of fallen trunks and splintered branches that blocked sight lines and channeled movement into deadly kill zones. The forest floor, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves, had been churned into a fetid mixture of mud, blood, and decomposing organic matter that clung to boots and equipment with nauseating persistence. German machine gun nests had been carved into the very roots of massive trees, creating nearly impregnable positions that could only be eliminated through close-quarters combat. The enemy had spent weeks fortifying these positions, using the natural terrain to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible approach. Wire entanglements, carefully concealed among the undergrowth, channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing grounds where German gunners waited with Teutonic patience. First Lieutenant Clifton Cates, leading a company of Marines from the 6th Regiment, discovered the true horror of woodland warfare during his first probe into the forest depths. His men advanced in single file along what appeared to be a game trail, only to find themselves caught in a carefully orchestrated ambush. Machine gun fire erupted from 3 different directions simultaneously. The muzzle flashes invisible in the forest gloom, while the bullets sparked off tree trunks and ricocheted through the canopy above. The fighting that erupted in those dark woods was unlike anything American forces had experienced since the Indian Wars of the previous century. This was not the sterile, long-range combat of modern warfare, but a return to the most primitive form of human conflict, man against man, eye to eye. With bayonet and grenade deciding the outcome, Marines found themselves crawling through underbrush, so thick that visibility was measured in feet rather than yards, never knowing if the next shadow concealed a friend or foe. As documented in the Washington Post's historical analysis of the battle, the Marines who entered Belleau Wood were forced to abandon conventional military tactics and rely instead on individual initiative and small unit cohesion. Squad leaders, like Sergeant Major John Quick, a veteran of the Spanish-American War, found that their previous combat experience was only marginally relevant to this new form of warfare. The forest stripped away all pretense of military order and reduced combat to its most basic elements. The psychological toll was enormous. Marines who had maintained their composure during the wheat field assault began to crack under the constant strain of woodland fighting. The inability to see more than a few yards in any direction, combined with the ever-present threat of snipers and the disorienting maze of fallen timber, created a sense of claustrophobia that was almost unbearable. Some men began talking to themselves, while others developed nervous tics that would persist long after the battle ended. Yet within this chaos, something remarkable was happening to the Marine Corps as an institution. The extreme conditions were forging bonds between men that transcended traditional military hierarchy. Officers and enlisted men shared foxholes, food, and ammunition without regard for rank. When Captain Peter Conady was killed by a sniper, his company sergeant assumed command without orders or hesitation, and the Marines continued fighting as if nothing had changed. The forest was teaching the Marines lessons that no peacetime training could impart. They learned to move silently through dense undergrowth, to communicate through hand signals and whispered codes, to distinguish between the sounds of friendly and enemy movement. Most importantly, they learned to trust each other completely, knowing that survival depended on the man beside them rather than on distant commanders or elaborate battle plans. June 15th brought no respite from the carnage that had consumed Belleau Wood for over a week. The forest floor was now carpeted with the detritus of modern warfare, spent cartridge cases, fragments of equipment, and the scattered remains of men who had answered their nation's call. Marine Corporal Don Paradise, his uniform torn and stained with mud and worse, crouched beside the body of his best friend and tried to make sense of the madness surrounding him. The German defenders had proven far more tenacious than Allied intelligence had predicted. These were not the demoralized troops that propaganda posters depicted, but seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front who understood intimately the brutal mathematics of woodland warfare. Every machine gun nest that the Marines eliminated seemed to be replaced by 2 more, each one positioned with the meticulous care of men who had learned their craft in the killing fields of Verdun and the Somme. Master Gunnery Sergeant Ernest Jansen had been fighting continuously for 9 days, surviving on adrenaline, caffeine, and the stubborn pride that defined his generation of Marines. His company had been reduced from 200 men to fewer than 60, yet those who remained fought with an intensity that bordered on the supernatural. They had moved beyond fear into a realm where death was simply another tactical consideration, no more significant than the weather or the terrain. The forest itself had become a character in this drama of human destruction. Trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of French kings now bore witness to a new kind of warfare, their ancient bark scarred by machine gun bullets and shrapnel from high explosive shells. The undergrowth that had once sheltered deer and wild boar now concealed the tools of industrial killing, automatic weapons, poison gas canisters, and explosive devices that could shred human flesh with mechanical efficiency. Medical evacuation in the dense woods proved nearly impossible, forcing Marines to carry their wounded comrades through maze-like passages. While under constant fire, Hospital Corpsman William Scanlon, attached to the 5th Regiment, performed surgical miracles under conditions that would have challenged physicians in well-equipped hospitals. Using nothing more than a field medical kit and boundless courage, he saved dozens of lives while bullets whistled overhead and shells exploded among the treetops. The psychological transformation of the Marine Corps was becoming apparent, even to the men experiencing it. These Marines were no longer the same soldiers who had arrived in France months earlier, with dreams of quick victory and glorious homecomings. The forest had burned away their illusions and replaced them with something harder and more enduring. They had discovered that they could endure unimaginable hardship, face overwhelming odds, and continue fighting when lesser men would have surrendered or fled. According to historical documentation from the Library of Congress archives, the fighting in Belleau Wood represented a watershed moment in American military history. The first time that American forces had faced a determined, well-equipped enemy in sustained combat since the Civil War. The lessons learned in those blood-soaked woods would influence Marine Corps doctrine for generations to come, establishing principles of small unit leadership, individual initiative, and tactical flexibility that remain relevant today. Private First Class Carl Brannan, writing in his diary during a brief lull in the fighting, captured the essence of what was happening to his fellow Marines. "We came here as boys playing at being soldiers. The forest is making us into something else entirely, something harder and more terrible than we ever imagined we could become. We are learning to be killers, but we are also learning to be brothers." The German High Command was beginning to take notice of these American Marines who refused to break under pressure. Intelligence reports described their fighting spirit as exceptional and their tactical adaptability as surprising. What the Germans could not understand was that they were witnessing the birth of a new military culture, one that would define the United States Marine Corps for the next century and beyond. The battle was far from over, but already the forest had claimed its price in blood and transformation. The Marines who would eventually emerge from Belleau Wood would be fundamentally different from the men who had entered it. They would carry with them scars that would never fully heal, memories that would never fade, and a shared identity forged in the crucible of the most brutal combat imaginable. Dawn on June 20th broke gray and sullen over Belleau Wood, the morning mist rising from ground so thoroughly soaked with blood that it squelched underfoot like a sponge. Major Maurice Shearer, now commanding what remained of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, studied the German positions through his field glasses and felt the weight of history pressing down upon his shoulders. For 2 weeks, his Marines had been hammering against the enemy defenses, paying for every yard of advance with casualties that would have broken lesser units. The Marines had learned to read the forest like a book written in violence and death. They could distinguish between the whistle of incoming artillery and the crack of sniper fire, could identify the specific sound signature of German Maxim machine guns versus their own Browning automatics. More importantly, they had developed an almost supernatural ability to coordinate small unit actions without formal communication, moving through the woods with the fluid precision of a pack of wolves. Sergeant Major Daniel Daly, his face gaunt from weeks of combat and inadequate rations, had become something of a legend among the younger Marines. At 44, he moved through the forest with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced death so many times that it no longer held any terror for him. His presence alone was worth a company of reinforcements, steadying nerves and inspiring acts of heroism that defied rational explanation. The German resistance was beginning to show signs of strain. Intercepted communications revealed that enemy commanders were requesting permission to withdraw from positions that had become untenable. The Marines' relentless pressure, combined with their apparent indifference to casualties, was wearing down defenders who had survived for years of European warfare. These Americans fought with a reckless courage that bordered on insanity, yet their tactical methods showed increasing sophistication. Captain Clifton Cates, who would later rise to become Commandant of the Marine Corps, was pioneering the small unit tactics that would become doctrine for generations of Marines. His men had learned to advance in small groups, using covering, fire and movement techniques that maximized their chances of survival, while maintaining offensive momentum. When one group was pinned down, another would flank the enemy position, forcing the Germans to divide their fire and creating opportunities for decisive action. The forest itself was beginning to show the effects of prolonged combat. Trees that had stood for centuries lay shattered and broken, their trunks reduced to splinters by artillery bombardment. The undergrowth that had once provided concealment for both sides had been stripped away by gunfire, creating clear fields of fire that favored the more aggressive force. The Marines were adapting faster than their German opponents, learning to use the changing terrain to their advantage. Individual acts of heroism were becoming commonplace, though many would never be officially recognized due to the chaotic nature of woodland combat. Private Henry Larson, despite being wounded twice, continued to carry ammunition to forward positions under heavy fire. When asked why he didn't seek medical attention, he reportedly replied that his wounds weren't bleeding as much as his country's honor would if they failed to take the wood. The psychological transformation of the Marine Corps was nearly complete. These men had discovered reserves of courage and endurance they never knew they possessed. They had learned to function effectively under conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime training. Most importantly, they had developed an unshakable faith in each other and in their ability to accomplish any mission, regardless of the odds or the cost. As documented in the Heritage Foundation's analysis of the battle, the fighting in Belleau Wood was creating a new model of American military effectiveness. The Marines were proving that American forces could match and exceed the combat effectiveness of Europe's veteran armies, but only by developing a unique fighting culture that emphasized individual initiative, small unit cohesion, and an almost religious commitment to mission accomplishment. The tide was turning, though at a cost that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Every square yard of Belleau Wood had been purchased with American blood, but that blood was not being spilled in vain. It was creating something new and powerful, a military institution that would become synonymous with courage, honor, and victory in the face of impossible odds. The morning of June 26 dawned clear and still over Belleau Wood, as if nature itself was holding its breath for the final act of this bloody drama. Captain Peter Connedy's replacement, First Lieutenant James Robertson, crouched among the splintered remains of what had once been a magnificent oak tree and surveyed the German positions one last time. After 20 days of the most brutal fighting in Marine Corps history, the end was finally within reach. The forest bore scars that would remain visible for generations. Ancient trees, some predating the French Revolution, lay scattered like broken matchsticks across ground so thoroughly churned by artillery that no trace of its original character remained. Shell craters filled with stagnant water reflected the pale morning sky, creating an otherworldly landscape that seemed more appropriate to some alien planet than the peaceful French countryside. Major Maurice Scheer's Marines had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength, but those who remained possessed a hardened competence that was almost frightening to behold. They moved through the devastated forest with the economy of motion that comes only from prolonged combat experience, wasting neither energy nor ammunition, reading the terrain and the tactical situation with an intuition that no amount of peacetime training could provide. The final German strongpoint was positioned in a natural depression near the center of the wood, protected by interlocking machine gun positions and defended by the remnants of several elite German units. These enemy soldiers had fought with skill and determination that commanded the Marines' grudging respect, but they were now facing men who had been transformed by 3 weeks of continuous combat into something approaching military perfection. Gunnery. Sergeant Ernest Jansen, his uniform more patches than original fabric, gathered his squad leaders for what everyone knew would be the final briefing. These Marines no longer resembled the eager young men who had charged across the wheat fields on June 6th. Their faces bore the gaunt lines of prolonged stress and inadequate nutrition, while their eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much death. Yet beneath their exhaustion burned an unquenchable determination to finish what they had started. The assault began without fanfare or dramatic speeches. At precisely 1000 hours, the Marines rose from their positions and advanced toward the German strongpoint. With the methodical precision of a machine designed for killing, they moved in small groups, using the natural terrain and the scattered debris of battle to mask their approach, communicating through hand signals and the subtle body language of men who had learned to read each other's intentions without words. The German defenders opened fire with everything they possessed, filling the air with a storm of lead that should have stopped any rational force in its tracks. But these Marines were no longer entirely rational. They had moved beyond normal human limitations into a realm where courage and determination mattered more than firepower or tactical advantage. When machine gun fire cut down the lead elements, the survivors simply stepped over their fallen comrades and continued advancing. According to the Navy Historical Center's documentation of the battle, the final assault on the German positions lasted less than 30 minutes, but those 30 minutes encapsulated everything the Marine Corps had learned during its baptism. By fire in Belleau Wood, small unit tactics, individual initiative, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat combined to overwhelm defenders who had held their positions against overwhelming odds for 3 weeks. When the last German machine gun fell silent, Marine Lieutenant James Robertson reportedly sent the message that would become part of Corps' legend. Wood's now United States Marine Corps entirely. But those simple words could not convey the true significance of what had been accomplished in the shattered forest. The Marines had not simply captured a piece of ground, they had created a new identity for themselves. And for their corps, the cost had been enormous, nearly 10,000 American casualties, including over 1,800 dead, represented the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history to that point. Yet those statistics failed to capture the true nature of what had been achieved. The Marines who emerged from Belleau Wood were fundamentally different from the men who had entered it, transformed by combat into something that would influence American military culture for generations to come. The silence that descended over Belleau Wood on the afternoon of June 26th was more profound than any sound that had preceded it. For the first time in 3 weeks, the ancient forest was free from the crack of rifle fire, the chatter of machine guns, and the whistle of incoming artillery. In that unnatural quiet, the surviving Marines began to comprehend the magnitude of what they had accomplished and the price they had paid for victory. Captain Clifton Cates, one of the few original company commanders still standing, walked through the positions his men had died to capture and tried to make sense of the transformation. He felt within himself the eager young officer who had led his Marines into the wheat fields on June 6th no longer existed. In his place stood someone harder, more capable, and infinitely more aware of both human courage and human frailty. The forest had taught him lessons that would guide him through a military career that would eventually lead to the highest levels of Marine Corps leadership. The German prisoners, gaunt and exhausted after weeks of defending positions that had become increasingly untenable, watched their captors with something approaching awe. These Americans were unlike any enemy forces they had encountered on the Western Front. European armies fought with skill and determination born of long military tradition. But these Marines possessed something different, a kind of controlled ferocity that seemed to draw strength from adversity rather than being weakened by it. Sergeant Major Daniel Daly, now a living legend among the surviving Marines, began the grim task of compiling casualty reports that would tell only part of the story of what had happened in the woods. The numbers were staggering. Entire companies had been reduced to squad strength, and some platoons had ceased to exist altogether. Yet those statistics failed to capture the true significance of what had been forged in the crucible of Belleau Wood. The French government, in recognition of the Marines' sacrifice and achievement, officially renamed Belleau Wood as Bois de la Brigade des Marines, the Wood of the Marine Brigade. It was an honor without precedent in French military history, acknowledging that something extraordinary had taken place in that blood-soaked forest. The Marines had not simply won a tactical victory. They had created a new standard for American military effectiveness. Word of the Marines' performance at Belleau Wood spread rapidly through the American Expeditionary Forces and back to the United States. Newspaper accounts, while necessarily limited by wartime censorship, conveyed enough information to capture the public imagination. The image of Marines charging across open ground in the face of machine gun fire, then grinding through weeks of forest combat without yielding an inch of ground, resonated with American concepts of courage and determination. As documented in various historical analyses, including those preserved in the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, the Battle of Belleau Wood represented more than just a military victory. It was the moment when the United States Marine Corps evolved from a relatively small force with a limited mission into an elite fighting organization with a distinctive culture and identity. The lessons learned in those woods would influence Marine training, doctrine, and ethos for generations to come. The transformation was visible in the survivors themselves. These Marines carried themselves differently now, with a quiet confidence, born of having faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. They had discovered that ordinary men could accomplish extraordinary things when bound together by training, tradition, and an uncompromising commitment to their mission and each other. This knowledge would become the foundation upon which the modern Marine Corps would be built. The legend of Belleau Wood would grow with each passing year, as Marine recruits learned about the devil dogs who refused to retreat and the officers who led from the front. The battle became a touchstone for Marine identity, a reminder that their corps had been tested in the crucible of modern warfare and had not been found wanting. Every Marine who followed would carry within themselves a piece of that legacy, forged in blood and sacrifice in a French forest during the summer of 1918. In the years that followed, as the Marine Corps grew in size and capability, the spirit of Belleau Wood would manifest itself in countless other battles, on countless other shores. From the beaches of Iwo Jima to the mountains of Afghanistan, Marines would draw strength from the knowledge that their predecessors had faced impossible odds and prevailed through courage, determination, and an unbreakable bond with their fellow Marines. The wood had been taken, but more importantly, the Marine Corps had been reborn.